Welcome to the Unknown Warrior podcast with Pete and Jason from Squeaky Pedal. Very happy to be joined by author Robert Newcome today, so author of The Name Beneath the Stone, Secret of the Unknown Warrior, which is a novel that kind of delves into a lot of the story of how the Unknown Warrior came to be, filling in a lot of gaps in fiction terms about kind of what maybe happened over different time periods and what would happen maybe if the Unknown Warrior was discovered, or it could be discovered, of this, the identity of him. So Robert, start us off then. So where did the whole idea for this kind of come from then? Where did you learn about the story of the Unknown Warrior?
Well, it was a number of years ago now. I was, like most people, I suppose, knew there was an Unknown Warrior. I knew that he was buried in Westminster Abbey. But apart from that, I knew really very little about the Unknown Warrior, unknown soldier. And I read an article. It was originally in the Daily Telegraph, I believe, but I read it in the Week. And it was a sort of 2-page article. And it went through all the details, many of the details you've been covering in your podcasts. And I was fascinated by it, really. It informed me an enormous amount. And I thought there's two things here. One, that this was an extraordinary event, as we've been seeing in the last few days on the telly and such like. So A, it was an extraordinary event, but B, the other thing that struck me was that here we have an extraordinary mystery, one of the sort of great mysteries of the 20th century. I was writing a novel at the time, but I thought there's a novel in here somewhere. And so I mulled around with various different ideas for a while and eventually came up with the plot for The Name Beneath the Stone.
And then, so where did you kind of start with your kind of research process? Obviously, like as we've discussed over various podcast episodes, there's a lot to kind of cover and a lot of intricacy and a lot of speculation, a lot of conjecture to kind of wade through. How did you kind of start the research process for that? And how do you kind of approach putting that into a novel? How do you get all that historical information and all these people? How do you bring these to life as you find out the research as you go along?
Well, unlike your other speakers, I'm not a historian. I'm a guy who writes books. So obviously the first thing I did, with the words unknown soldier, I went on the internet and found all sorts of articles. A lot of them, of course, based around David Railton. So I built up I sort of had a folder. I built up various sort of articles. I then went into the Imperial War Museum. I sort of led into some little back office where they showed me the Pathé News clip that we've been seeing on the telly over the last few days. And so I found out a bit more there, and I came across various books. A very good one, I don't know if you know it, Neil Hansen, The Unknown Soldier. That's very detailed. So I read all that. And in fact, in the first half of his book, he follows the stories of 4 soldiers, sort of echoing the 4 bodies that were picked up. And that was sort of in my mind of doing that in my novel. So that rather kiboshed that plan. But I'd sort of come up with a different idea at that stage. So I did all that to find out more about the unknown soldier. But the other thing I needed to find out about was, of course, the First World War. Again, not being a historian, my knowledge of the First World War went back to school days. I'd done it at O-level, or GCSE, more modern equivalent. So I dug out my old books that I still had, sort of A.J.P. Taylor, The First World War. And I also acquired, I've got a stack of about 20 books now, books about the First World War, because a lot of the story is based in 1917. And just some of the people, Richard Holmes and Gary Sheffield, and then Lynn MacDonald, they called it Passchendaele, Max Arthur. So, he did a lot from the perspective of the soldiers in the trenches. So I read some of his books. And the one that really struck me, I don't know if you know, is Her Private's We by Frederick Manning. He was a soldier in the First World War. He fought in the Somme. He was a writer. And after the war, a few years later, he actually wrote a novel. And he was the lead character in the novel, but it was written as a novel, but really it was a sort of biography. A really, really powerful book. Ernest Hemingway said he read it every year because it was the best book ever written about war. And that, in fact, that book gave me the sort of the atmosphere that I wanted to create in the trenches. So quite a bit of the book, I know, Jason, you've read it, quite a bit of the book, it's not about just in the front line, but also in reserves. And a lot of Manning's book was about that. So, and the final thing was my grandfather's diaries. My grandfather was a major in the Royal Artillery in the First World War, and he wrote diaries. I came across them in my father's house, and they were incredibly boring. They were totally factual. So a typical thing he'd write would be June the whatever, got up, had breakfast in the officers' mess, met Major so-and-so, inspected the guns, and sort of more detail. And at the end, the Fifth Army advanced and took 3,000 prisoners. Full stop. So there was absolutely no sort of emotion or anything. And it was those diaries I used as a basis for, as we'll talk about, Captain Peter Harding's diaries in the book.
One of the strengths for me in the book was the fact that you did show, as you said, not only the front line and what the soldiers were going through in the trenches, but also the impact that their being away and being in serious danger had on their families and loved ones back home. And that then enabled you to explore the impact of that later on with The Unknown Warrior, because you understood the context of these people, you know, looking after their loved ones. How did you approach trying to sort of cover that emotion that was there, that raw emotion? Because obviously we've kind of been studying The Unknown Warrior a little bit in more sort of factual terms, in this happened and that happened, and trying to uncover evidence. But obviously it's really important not to forget the important emotional connection that makes it so special.
Yeah, well, one of the characters is a chap called George Latham, who's father of a young officer serving in the front. And I sort of based him on Kipling, really. If you remember that quote of Kipling's, "If they ask us how we died, tell them because their fathers lied." And that crops up a number of times in the book. And so I wanted that to come in as the this man had encouraged his son to go to war and then felt terribly guilty about what was happening. And I thought it was important to do that. One of the central characters is someone called Joyce, whose fiance is out actually fighting, I haven't been through those circumstances myself, so I had to kind of imagine it. But terrible, and of course that's very relevant to the when we come to the burial of the unknown soldier, what they went through and not knowing what was happening much of the time.
And your novel flits between a number of different times and dates. How did you go about trying to fit all of those together and weave this quite intricate story actually together?
Yeah, well, with difficulty. I mean, I had a great big sheet of A3 paper, and I had all the different sort of bits going on with lines drawn between them. Fundamentally, there are three stories. There's the modern story in this century, 2011, of Sarah Harding, who's a key character, and she finds love letters from a chap called Daniel, serving in the trenches, to her grandmother. So she finds these love letters in a file as her father is dying. She speaks to her father and says, "Dad, who is this chap Daniel writing to your mother?" And her father, who's sort of very ill, not dying, just mentions the two words "unknown soldier," which is what sets her off on a long inquiry. And she involves a historian called James Marchant. And as the book progresses, so they think we've actually discovered who the unknown soldier is. Remember, this is fiction, but that's what they're thinking. And you can imagine the excitement of that and the drama of that. The second element of the story is this chap, Daniel Dawkins, and he's really the heart of the book, I would say. In fact, at one point, I called the book Daniel Dawkins. He's serving in the trenches in 1917 in a fictional regiment, the Berkshire Light Infantry. And so it follows, a lot of the book follows that. And then the third is this character, Peter Harding, starts in 1920, which of course is a significant date. And he is involved in the whole project of finding a body, bringing it back to England to be buried in Westminster Abbey. So the three all sort of intersperse as I go through the book. And it was quite a juggling act, so that the reader didn't know what was happening before it actually happened in the book, if you see what I mean.
I can sympathise with that research process of, just a massive sheet of A3 and just trying to join up timelines. We've been there. I feel your pain.
Oh, I'm sure you have. Yes, and you end up with paralysis by analysis, don't you? If you're not.
Yeah, it's very true. Very true. Yeah, and so thinking about that, the immense kind of secrecy that kind of went into choosing the body, as we've kind of discussed in previous episodes, and obviously that the important thing is that the job was in reality, the job was done so well that no one will ever know, the identity, because it was such a secret operation, and they did such a good job. But at the time, there was, as there is in your book, there's speculation about who it could be, and you're kept guessing, and throughout the book as to maybe do they find out who it is or do they not find out who it is. But in reality, though, there was speculation at the time, wasn't it? And since in the century since, about potentially who it could be, and names crop up, haven't they, Jason? There's always been kind of rumours and people that think we could join some dots together and work out who it might be.
I heard at one point that a whole load of mothers actually dreamt that it was their son who was being buried on November the 11th. Yes, well, this is, of course, is a central part of the book. Could someone have known? So this is where I move into the realms of fiction. And I keep waiting for guys like you to say to me, it's totally impossible what you've written, but no one has said so to me as yet. I rather imagined, being interviewed on telly. I don't know if years ago, sort of when Monty Python produced The Life of Brian, and there was Malcolm Muggeridge absolutely ranting about this book. And I think Michael Palin said, well, about the film, said, have you actually seen the film? He said, well, no, I don't need to. And I sort of rather imagine someone ranting at me, and eventually I say, well, have you actually read the book and know what happens at the end? Yes, so I went round in circles thinking, how might someone have known? And so this is where we enter this chap, Captain Harding, in 1920. Without giving too much away, he was in charge of one of the digging parties. Now, that's a really interesting thing, in that I don't know about you, but the one bit of information I haven't been able to identify is who led those 4 digging parties, or the 6th, perhaps, as referred to by Reverend Kendall. The key is those 4 digging parties, and when Wyatt chooses one of the 4 bodies, that at the heart of it is, if anybody knew, that's where it would be. So starting from that, I then wove in this fictional narrative of Harding finding something on one of the bodies, a photograph, and he was really pressed for time. They had to be at St. Paul at a certain point, really pressed for time. He thought, there's no name on it, there's nothing on it, I will just hide that. And that was then the thing that led all the way through to him actually discovering who the unknown soldier and the unknown warrior was, and a burden that he carried with him for the rest of his life. But ultimately, as the story goes, he then sort of passes that information on. So I don't know what your perspective on that, whether you thought, well, that's absolutely impossible, or whether you thought, well, I suppose that could have happened.
One of the most fascinating juxtapositions for me was the fact that the ambulance breaks down with Captain Harding in it on the way to exhume the bodies. And when we read the Cecil Smith letters, where Cecil Smith is talking about taking the other soldiers that weren't selected as part of the Unknown Warrior to take them to the Albert Bapaume Road, his ambulance breaks down as well.
Yes, yeah. And
so there's sort of a weird sort of, reality sort of mirroring fiction going on there. And when I read that, I thought about the Cecil Smith letters and thinking that exact same thing happened, but with the bodies coming away from St. Paul rather than them going to get them.
Yeah, extraordinary. I mean, I heard that. Was it when you were talking to Mark in one of the podcasts? I think that's when I just heard it. And I thought, blimey, that echoes what I wrote. Extraordinary.
Exactly, which is extraordinary. But like you say, it's a lot of the research that we've done is more into what happened to the bodies that weren't selected, and obviously just naming some of the people that were involved. And I think one of the greatest things for me was to be able to, as you said, you saw the actual recreation of the process of the orders being passed, and then people like Captain Harding then going out and getting these bodies. And obviously we've been reading about some of the people at St. Paul, and you start placing some of those people in those roles, and it's fascinating to see it being brought to life rather than it being just names and faces on photographs. You're seeing the operation being carried out by people, and it's coming to life. One of the main characters that I found absolutely fascinating was Daniel Dawkins. He's got a really deep backstory. He's deeply affected by both his past and what he's experiencing. Can you tell us a little bit more about him and where specific inspiration from him and his story came from?
The whole point, of course, of The Unknown Soldier is we don't know, was it an officer, an NCO, a private? Was he a brave man? Was he a coward? Nobody will know what that is. So I started off thinking I want him to be a private soldier. And soldier is a correct word, isn't it? So we refer to the unknown warrior because that is inclusive of all the services, but the strong likelihood is it was a soldier. So I started off with that, and really his character developed as we went through. You asked me earlier how to approach recreating this important character. I wanted him to be a brave man. I wanted him to be a leader. I wanted him to be a bit of a rebel. And he is those various things. And you mentioned the backstory. And so that sort of comes through as you go through the book. The other thing that I wanted to bring through was that this nihilism. He had been fighting for a long time. He'd survived much longer than most people did. He'd actually survived the Somme. And he's developed this nihilism, this sort of death wish almost, this sense of he's seen so many of the soldiers around him die that he now just feels it's right for him to go right until the end. And his bravery almost comes from this desire to die, if you could put it that strongly. He's very brave because he did not fear death right until towards the end of the book. And I think one of the characters at the end said, well, he was brave at the end. You often talk about bravery, and sometimes bravery comes from almost a lack of imagination. People just, go for it. But when you fear being killed and yet you still go and do these things, that's a very powerful thing. And I think towards the end of the book, you've got Dawkins, who it actually wants to live and then continues to be incredibly bold and take this action. So I wanted him ultimately, as we'd like to think of the Unknown Soldier, to be a very brave, powerful sort of individual.
And you've served in the army yourself, so, and you're talking about their kind of bravery and the emotions of being in action. How has that, your own personal experiences, played into the creation of the characters within the book?
Yeah, well, it's going back a bit now. I joined the army, I went to Sandhurst when I was 19, I think, joined my regiment when I was 20 and went straight out to Northern Ireland. And I had not had really any training in internal security work. And I joined a battalion of seasoned soldiers who'd done 3 months of training for that. And fairly soon found myself commanding a platoon of soldiers. And I had a whole series, enormous cock-ups, frankly, of where I kept getting it wrong. If any of the soldiers from that era are listening, they'll probably recall some of them. So as a young guy of 20, commanding a platoon of, say, 30 soldiers, it was incredibly important, the relationship I had with my platoon sergeant, my corporals, and my private soldiers. And you do develop this extraordinary relationship, an officer and his soldiers, which is friendly, but at the same time, they know that you could put them in jail. I remember on the first night I arrived in Germany, one of the, I met up with the soldiers in a bar, and one of them was completely drunk, and he said about my predecessor, well, we call him Mick. What do we call you? And I sort of, me spotty 20-year-old said, you call me sir. And he probably thought I was a right sort of stuck up ponce or whatever. But anyway, that's a relationship, but you become very friendly, but you've got this interesting relationship. So I tried to weave that in Dawkins' relationship with Lieutenant Latham, and Dawkins is very supportive of this officer as you go through. So that was kind of based upon my experiences and knowledge of that sort of thing.
When any kind of history book or novel kind of is written, it's always kind of a quite sensitive, war and emotions of war and bravery. It's always quite a sensitive subject to kind of get across in quite a, an emotive and a, realistic way as well, isn't it? So how is it kind of difficult to kind of mirror that in a novel, in a sense, to kind of be sensitive but also kind of be factual, but also kind of be also tell a story at the same time without kind of being sensationalist or being at extremity of one or the other?
Absolutely. And I have a horror of sentimentality, yet I was trying to describe, these intense emotions that you have on the battlefield, and as you mentioned earlier, people back at home, and trying to do that without slipping into sentimentality, which is a very fine line, really. And probably some people will feel it does get a bit sentimental. But so it's trying to do that as you go through. I got very interested in sort of post-traumatic stress disorder a long time ago, so reading about the Vietnam War. And I remember watching a program where a Vietnam vet was discussing returning home afterwards. And he said, it's as if the nerve endings on your fingers have been burnt off and you just can't feel anything. You're detached from everything around you. And that struck me. And so actually my first novel was about a soldier again, but returning home after traumatic experience and the effect that has on him, and exactly that thing of not being able to come back and experience life fully. And so Dawkins does return home on a couple of occasions to be with his girlfriend, fiancée, Joyce. And I try to sort of fit in that sense of detachment from his surroundings. And I have a scene where he sort of walks through Windsor, and, everyone wants to come up as they would because they see his short hair and his bronzed face, and they want to shake his hand and say, well done. And he just backs away from it. He can't really cope with this sort of normal human contact, I suppose. So I try and weave that in throughout the book.
And what sort of feedback are you getting to the book, especially as we've just covered the 100th anniversary of the burial of the unknown warrior in Westminster Abbey. What feedback have you had? I
would say this, wouldn't I? But I've had some very positive feedback. I've had, quite a few people have read it now, and I get a few points. One, people say it's a bit of a page turner. I've had people write to me who I don't know saying, I started it on Saturday and I finished it on Sunday. I just needed to know what's going on. So any novelist would say they want people to be turning the pages. So there's that aspect. A sort of second aspect is people have said, yes, it is an emotional book. We kind of know what's going to happen to Daniel Dawkins, don't we, if I'm portraying him as the unknown soldier. So, but it still, for some people, comes as a bit of a sort of a tearjerker almost at the end, and also what goes on with some of his comrades. The third thing people are saying is that they have learned a lot about the burial of the unknown soldier, particularly building up. And I've had people say, gosh, the events of yesterday, because we're now talking on the 12th, the events of yesterday meant much more to me having read your book. So those are the sort of the three main things are coming back to me at the moment.
I think that's it. Like, certainly for me, like going on all the research that we've kind of been a part of, like that you do, as you learn more about all the people that are involved and the story behind it, you do come more personally kind of invested in it, and you do find you do find more meaning in it, as it were. And do you think that's sorry, go on.
Yeah, well, I was going to say one of the other things you sort of talked to me about before was the importance and the relevance today of the unknown warrior, and I got fascinated in the subject. I wanted to interest other people in the subject, so I did it through the form of fiction. But obviously, there's a lot of fact in with the fiction. But I do feel it's still very relevant. It was interesting seeing the television coverage yesterday, and they'd cut to different parts of the country, and you saw not only old people but young people as well standing there, the 2-minute silence. And so I think the story does live on. And of course, the unknown soldier, represents those who went missing, but also represents every soldier who's died abroad, particularly over the centuries. And we've had the recent army fighting in Afghanistan and in the Balkans, in Iraq. So, it still holds that resonance thing. I think it's still a very powerful, iconic symbol, isn't it?
It is indeed. It is indeed. And that's been one of the nicest things, actually, is seeing how people are still deeply connected to it today and how relevant it is today, just as much as it was 100 years ago. It's continued to have that mystique. And the interest is still there in the story and in how it was created and as what it means to the nation. But thank you very much for coming on the podcast, Robert. Really appreciate you speaking to us. And having read the book myself, I would recommend The Name Beneath the Stone, The Secret of the Unknown Warriors, for anybody who's interested in the story. So thanks very much for your time today.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed talking to you. Cheers.